We're actually dedicating this show to the late Alan Williams.
Yes. A guy who I'm sure many of you have, or if you haven't read the book, The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, you're surely aware of it. And it is worth reading. Taken with a grain of salt, because a lot of it, of course, is mythologizing the Beatles. John Lennon liked the book, and it's a hell of an entertaining read.
Well, I think it captures the spirit of the times. That's point.
Really what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it as sort of historical fiction, you know, it's quite enjoyable.
It's got some facts in there as well, though. It's
a few slipped
pure
in.
fiction.
Right. But that's the one, we've got a few movies. We've got Birth of the Beatles, and we've got Backbeat, and we've got Nowhere Boy. I wish somebody would make a movie out of this book. I mean, that would be the most entertaining of all. Really.
Right. And for me, in the mid-'70s, it was something of a Bible, this book.
Yes.
As inaccurate as we now know it may be, but it was just fantastic. It had the humor.
Yes.
And it transported me to a time.
Absolutely. I mean, it really, it's sort of the literary equivalent of A Hard Day's Night when it comes to defining the Beatles as personalities, what they were at that time, as well as all these other colorful characters along the way, not least Alan Williams, but also Lord Woodbine, Bruno Koschmider.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic.
Yeah. And so for me, also, through the years, Alan, I've come to appreciate his contribution to the Beatles, which has been denigrated in many quarters. Now, when it came to comments by the Beatles about the man who gave the Beatles away, John was way more generous than either George or Paul. In George's case, I know there were several times that he took digs at Alan during the 1970s.
Oh, yeah. There's the Ruddles thing.
Right.
In the Ruddles booklet.
Yes.
Yeah, how that guy is characterized.
Arthur Scouse.
Yeah. So,
and we know that Eric Idle got that from George.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, he was the one whispering in his ear the whole time. And in fact, I read that for the making of it, when they were kind of laying out the concept, that George got them a screening of The Long and Winding Road to work from.
Yes.
Yeah. So looky there, inside baseball.
Yeah.
But yeah, as far as the Alan Williams books go, it's very striking because, he's the same guy who made that quote when he was the one who showed up in court to suppress the Star Club tapes.
Yes.
About, one drunk making a deal with another bunch of drunks doesn't constitute a business deal or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, why he was so disdainful over that terrific performance, as if he had never even listened to it. I mean, he should have been proud of it. It's pretty amazing.
Right.
But as far as the Alan Williams book goes, he was asked about it specifically in Amsterdam in early 77, I think February, when he was doing some promotion for 33 1/3 throughout Europe. And Beatles Unlimited actually ran the exchange about it. What do you think of Alan Williams' book, The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away? I think it's stupid. Ringo said that too. But John and Paul really appreciated it. Have you read John's comment on it? No. And Paul McCartney's in Philadelphia. They said it was a really good book. Have you read the book? Yeah. It is a good story. If you believe what it says, this much is true, indicates 10%. And this is what Alan Williams dreamt, indicates 90%.
Yeah. Well, and
I thought he came off pretty well in that book.
Yeah, I know. And actually, George took some even more aggressive digs at Alan, I know, in other interviews. Now, the inference there is that Paul had nice things to say about the Alan Williams book in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Spectrum. I think that was early 76 during the Wings Over America tour.
Yeah.
And Alan actually told us when we were at the first couple of conventions, I wasn't at the first one in Norwich, but I know Mark said that he said this in Norwich, and I definitely said it at the Ali Pali in London, that when he saw Paul backstage, Paul was running the other way, trying to avoid him, and then couldn't. And then it was like, oh, Alan.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, John, I think, was the one always with the biggest heart when it came to these things. And, of course, there was that endorsement that he sent Alan that was reproduced on the paperback cover.
Yeah, in the American edition, for sure.
Yeah. For those who want to find out what it took to become a famous Beatle, Alan Williams' book is the only book that can give eyewitness insight into the making of the Beatles. Obviously, everyone does not have the same memory, and certain events, people, I do not remember in any way. But a lot of it brought back a very important part of my life. I laughed a lot. And then it was also reproduced there because it's John's, notorious typing.
Yes.
And he just says, excuse typing, spelling, etc. You can correct it. All the best. John Lennon, 75. But that's nice. That's sweet.
He was very nostalgic about the Beatles' past, especially in that period there.
Yeah.
It was coming off the Lost Weekend where, as we know, he was in a very good place with his Beatles past and his Beatles history.
Yeah.
At some point it evaporated because come 1980, he's just swinging at everything the Beatles ever stood for and go back to high school and all that nonsense. But that is where he really is at peace with that legacy. And it's very telling, the stories that we have about how when he had that closeness with Paul during the quote-unquote lost weekend, he would sit him down and play him Beatle bootlegs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think that had John lived to actually read the work of our guest on today's show, he would have been the one who would have appreciated it the most.
Yeah, definitely. It was around that time as well that he did the blurb for the Jürgen Vollmer book, Rock and Roll Times.
Yes.
That was those Hamburg pictures as well as other acts. And I don't have it in front of me, but the exact quote was something about captured the beauty and the spirit of the Beatles.
Yes.
Yeah, so there you go. I mean, that is the Lennon that should have endured, and it's unfortunate it didn't.
But the Beatles were his baby.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was coming to peace, having destroyed them. At last, from this perspective, I think he recognized what he had actually destroyed and regretted it. It's really interesting that just as there are Pete Best supporters and detractors, no, he was the equivalent of Ringo as a drummer.
Right.
And no, he was lousy, and that was why he got fired.
Yeah.
But even to this day, despite all the evidence that's out there, I can't believe we're still having these debates.
Right.
Just as it is with Pete, it is with Alan Williams, where no, he was just a booking agent, and him clinging to the story for decades. It's just nonsense. He was an opportunist who tried to claim some of the Beatles' fame and glory.
Actually, quite the opposite. I think he always downplayed his role.
Well, Mark Lewisohn did that wonderful tweet upon his death being reported. No Alan Williams, no Hamburg, no Beatles.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
that says it all. That says everything you need to know. And, whatever you want to quibble over what his title was, that is everything.
I have to say that for Mark and me, Alan's also been a source of great humour down the years, his many misadventures.
Yes.
Which he would cop to himself.
Yeah, he was very self-deprecating.
Absolutely. So, it has been fantastic. And that's why Mark is joining us today on this show. Because, it's just right that we kind of have one of our typical conversations, in this case, a three-way one, about Alan Williams. So welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be the third member of the duo.
There you go.
You had penned that wonderful tribute that appeared subsequent to your tweet, A Hand in Our Lives. Would you care to share that with the listeners?
No.
Okay.
Moving
on.
Oh, you mean you want me to read it?
That would be nice.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was moved to write this because, as Richard says, Alan was not only instrumental in the Beatles' lives, but he was also big in my life and big in Richard's. And we'll talk about this, I know, but we both go back, Richard and I, to the 1970s, the first Beatles conventions in the UK, and Alan was instrumental in putting those on. So we have many memories of him from that period. And when he died, I thought I would write this just to set something down about his involvement in the Beatles. And just to also look, and I called it A Hand in Our Lives, because I just want to show the connectedness of people, of how a person can make a contribution in others' lives, even if personally he doesn't really profit from it. So this is what I wrote. A Hand in Our Lives, Alan Richard Williams, entrepreneur, 1930 to 2016. Born in hard times 1930, Alan Williams wasn't of the rock generation, and it was never his preferred music. He was a little Liverpool Welshman who had chucked in his qualified trade of plumbing to open up a coffee bar. His cafe, the Jacaranda, was the city's one hangout for students and beatniks. Williams was a beatnik himself. He had the beard, wrote the poetry, and braved people's vicious barbs because he had married mixed race. He was a man whose ideas were so individual, so left field, that he suddenly opened up work for fledgling English musicians in the bars and clubs of Hamburg, Germany, the effect of which galvanized a generation of rock kids whose music has long been enriching our lives. None of this was meant to be. It's ridiculous to suggest that anything like this could be planned. It happened as a byproduct of Alan Williams's singular personality. In 1960, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison were art school and grammar school youths, passionate about music, but close to clueless in getting themselves organised. Then, clear out of the blue, from that May to December, they got up and running, found out who they really were, found out what they really wanted and how they might just grab it. And Alan Williams had created their every opportunity. Then they ditched him, cut him out. Braving they had valid cause, they blocked his 10% commission on their second Hamburg club season. When a highly annoyed Williams initiated legal action, the Beatles had to respond. Charles Munro, an upright Liverpool gent born in 1908, became the first lawyer to be hired by the Beatles. Other problems have kept armies of attorneys engaged in times since and those to come. So different was the world of 1960, Charles Munro was wise, not ignorant, to document them as a jazz group in his paperwork. This much tainted in mainstream life was pop or beat or rock music before the Beatles changed all that. Williams dropped the case and moved on. He always moved on. As well as the coffee bar, he'd just opened Liverpool's first 60s nightclub, the Blue Angel, where, once he'd let them in, the Beatles did their after-hours socialising, chatting up birds, even beyond having million-selling records. In August 1960, Lennon, McCartney and Harrison had strapped their guitars on the roof of Williams' minibus. Then he'd stepped from behind the espresso machine to drive their 625-mile free ride to the wilds of Hamburg. 39 months later, the Beatles are catapulted to a measure of mass fame unknown in our civilization. On national TV, in the Royal Variety performance, they were giving the Knobs a shot of the Isley Brothers, and John was suggesting they join in by rattling their jewellery. The Beatles were adorably and edgily it in ways so unimaginable that Williams grabbed a cushion and hurled it at the screen. They'd been his and slipped through his fingers. At 33, Alan Williams' exotic life was still much closer its start than end. He carried on high living until sheer years brought him down. You could buy him a pint in the bars of his beloved Liverpool, watch him lose as many friends as he made, and witness a character, absolutely. The Beatles' extraordinary talents for music and communication, their humour, energy, artistry, and stunning honesty, all this was theirs and theirs alone, which means that Alan Williams' place in history is written, because it's provably likely that without his eccentric enterprise, we'd never have known them.
Fan-frickin-tastic. Yep. Brilliant. Yeah. Where did that appear?
I just posted it on Twitter and Facebook. That was all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Really terrific. That really nails it. One of the things that brings to mind are the assertions by no less than George that Alan was never the Beatles' manager. There was never a contract, a management contract with him. He was, if anything, just a booking agent. You obviously disagree with that. On what basis would you classify him as their first manager?
Actually, did George do that? I remember George having the downs on Alan, particularly when A Man Who Gave the Beatles Away came out in the mid-70s. He chipped away at Alan a few times, and of course in the Ruttles, not in the film, but in the book that went with the album, he had a big chip at Alan in that. What Eric Idle did, but based entirely on information given by George.
Right.
Called him Arthur Scouse, the Beatles' the Ruttles' first manager, the Ruttles' first manager, I'm paraphrasing here, which they got as the result of a bet, brackets which they lost. But I don't remember, did George really say that Alan wasn't their first manager?
I don't recall him saying he wasn't our manager. What I do remember him saying was referring to Alan as their agent.
Yeah. You know, it's a small distinction. What they can't deny is what effect he had on their career trajectory.
Right, but what I wanted to ask Mark is, why would you classify him as a manager as opposed to a booking agent?
Because he didn't only get them bookings, he actually got them there as well.
Right.
I mean, the Hamburg thing is extraordinary. He had other reasons for wanting to go to Hamburg. He'd already been once and wanted to go back. And then he went back again to see the Beatles a couple of months after they got there. But that's part of the reason, and also the fact that he really did represent them. If you wanted to get to the Beatles for a short period of time, you actually went to him.
Right.
Yeah, he had a business card with the Beatles' name on it, but rather than crediting himself as manager, it says on it sole direction with his phone number.
Which, funnily enough, is the same phrase that Brian Epstein used on his management, his business cards of the Beatles.
So was that sort of the standard operating procedure of the day?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe they got the terminology from some other card. I don't know. I'm not sure. But the phone number on that card, in fact, when I went to see Alan a few years ago, he said to me, well, even though it was his card that he had printed, he said, "Whose phone number is that? That's not my phone number."
Did you try calling it?
Well, no, I looked at it and I recognized it immediately as being the best's phone number. So the card is obviously from when they first got back from Hamburg the first time in December 60, January 61.
Yeah. Right. So Royal 7943 was the best?
That was the Blue Angel Club.
Oh, okay. Stanley 1556.
Stanley, is that what it is? 1556. Yeah, that was the best phone number at Hayman's Green.
And with Alan's name on the card?
Yes.
Wow. So basically people are going to call Hayman's Green, get Mona, and be asking to speak to Alan.
I haven't looked at that card for a while. Remind me, is Alan's name on that?
It says A. Williams above the phone number Royal 7943. And then for bookings, it says Stanley 1556. So they're making a distinction there.
Yeah. So that proves that essentially you would go to the bests for the bookings, and you go to Alan for something else. You go to the bests if you wanted to book the Beatles, because that's the thing they took care of on behalf of John, Paul, and George. The one thing that we know most clearly about is the letter that got reproduced in Rave in 1964 and then ended up in the Roy Carr and Tony Tyler book in 75, where she tried to get them on Granada television in 1961 and got a rejection letter from David Plowright. But apart from that, I can't think of anything else that she actively did. I mean, she was keen to promote anything that Peter was doing, because the Beatles were Peter's group, as she called them. Then she did bits and pieces, but she was never their manager. I know Pete was there for it, believe it or not.
He was in the cavern?
He was actually in the cavern that lunchtime when the Granada thing, because the thing that most upset him about being chucked out of the Beatles was that they were about to do their first TV thing.
Right. So he was the guy yelling, "We want Pete"?
He was probably there when it was shouted, and that may have been one of the reasons why it was shouted.
Right.
Not suggesting he was. I don't think Pete ever shouted that loud.
So let's touch on some of the things that in your piece about Alan there. And one of the things that struck me, of course, that we discovered down the years is how much of a bohemian Alan was, really, and how he was on a kind of cutting edge himself in some respects. Yeah.
He married Beryl, and Beryl is of Chinese descent. Her family were Chinese. She herself is Chinese, but I mean, her parents, I think, were immigrants, first generation immigrants from China. I'm not entirely clear on that, but I believe that's right. And they were both born in 1930, and they married in 55. And although Liverpool likes to consider itself a melting pot, it actually has quite a few religious schisms within it. And they were the recipient of quite a lot of racial taunting when they went around together. Alan told me people would spit at them in public.
Wow.
So that gives you a measure of how individual Alan was, because a lot of people would not enter into that kind of relationship because it's, not going to be liked by people. But Alan didn't care about that. He would just do his own thing. And he and Beryl ended up, although they were ultimately estranged, they were never divorced, and she still really took care of him. And they were together, therefore, for over 60 years. And he had the beard. That incredible picture of the Beatles on their way to Hamburg when they stopped the war memorial. He looks like some kind of Russian Bolshevik.
There's also a photo of him with that beard outside. Is it outside the Jack with Janice the stripper?
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. If that is Janice.
Right.
Everybody's been called Janice the stripper.
Right. Jan Carson.
I think even you've been called Janice.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm very proud of that.
Funny, isn't it, that when they did film the scene with the stripper in 1967, that her name was Jan?
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
the chances of that?
All strippers are named Jan, I guess.
Yeah.
So
I have a topless photograph of Jan the stripper from 1960.
Oh, do you share?
You would.
Yeah.
Is it laminated, I hope?
The guy who took the pictures of the Beatles at the audition for Larry Parnes and Billy Fury actually took a topless photograph of her. And when I went to interview him, he said, "Have you seen this picture?" And of course I hadn't. And I took it and showed it to Alan, and he was amazed that I had a picture of Janice.
So that's in the engorged version of Tune In?
Yeah, the 38D version.
Did you ever try to track her down?
I tried, but I mean, how do you find someone who wasn't using her real name in the first place?
Right.
Yeah.
Is Jan Carson still around?
Not that I know of. I have looked for her, but again, it's not easy to find people like that. I mean, I'm pretty adept at finding people, but people in that kind of profession, they don't always use their real names, and unless you can see her employment contract, you're never going to find out what it was.
Right.
So let's get back to Alan, as I said, as the kind of the bohemian and this guy on the edge of the artistic scene in Liverpool.
Yeah, I wanted to interject something there because it was very striking in your description there. He was sort of this defiantly outsider within his community, and how that resonates with the Beatles' own personas.
Yes, it does. It does. He was as much of an individual in a sense as they were.
And how they would have clicked with each other because of that. Even if they can't put their finger on what this mutual attraction is, we could see it from this distance.
Yeah, he was definitely an iconoclast, Alan. He ploughed his own furrow in life and went through upsetting an awful lot of people. But he never changed his ways. He was always a complete individual.
Mm-hmm.
He also did write poetry.
Yes.
Now, when Richard and I both got the British edition of The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, there was quite a long anti-Larry Parnes thing in that book. But when we got the American edition, I got it at a Beatles convention in Holland. For some reason, there was somebody was selling the American paperback of that book. That had something the British edition didn't have, which was a poem called Ponce Upon a Time. Ponce Upon a Group, in which he said, "This is not, I repeat, not about Larry Parnes." And that was clearly enough for the American publisher to take a risk with it. Whereas the British publisher clearly would have nothing to do with it, and quite rightly so. Because a few years ago, I was sitting with Alan and I said, "That poem in the American book, Ponce Upon a Group, is that about Larry?" And he went, "Oh, yeah."
What was his beef with Larry?
It was about poncing upon a group and leaving them high and dry, basically.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So if you look at the American edition, you will see that. So what we have here is a man who ran a cafe, was in a mixed race marriage, had a beard, and wrote poetry.
Right.
So he's not quite the kind of guy that, when you think of him in those terms, he's not quite the kind of guy that we would see in later years carousing at conventions.
He's also not your sort of typical, stereotypical shyster.
Right. Music promoter, shark.
Right. You're right.
Yeah. I mean, Richard and I, we talked long about how ultimately in Alan's business deals, the one loser would be him.
Yes.
There's a pattern here.
And I love him for that. I really love the fact that he had all these ideas and tried them all, and none of them quite worked. He was always, looking for a fortune and never made it. But along the way, he opened up all sorts of opportunities for other people, almost by accident.
Despite himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the Hamburg thing, he wasn't intending to, help anyone's artistic development. No. He was looking for an opportunity to sell acts to clubs, as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. The great thing about the whole Hamburg adventure is it's still peppered with his screw-ups.
Well, the business with Bruno Koschmieder, that was the key relationship was him and Bruno. And they fell out almost immediately. But of course, by then the Beatles were there and the blue touch paper had been lit. But he himself made almost nothing from it.
Right.
And then they cut him out of it anyway.
Alan Williams is the man who gave the Beatles away. He was their manager, but handed them to Brian Epstein for nothing and threw in Jerry and the Pacemakers as well.
I had a row with Lennon over money, basically, over commission. We didn't agree. And in actual fact, I made a classical statement, said, "Right, Lennon, you'll never work again, mate, How about that, I've been hurt twice, I can honestly say. One is the reception for A Hard Day's Night, that everybody in Liverpool appeared to be invited, except me. And the other time was rather amusing when I come to think back of it. It was the Sunday night at the Palladium, the first night, Sunday night at the Palladium, and they went down big, and I just picked up my shoe and threw it at the television. And that was about it.
It's a fantastic story, the whole business with Bruno Koschmider, because there's that ridiculously unlikely coincidence of them bumping into one another in Soho in London.
Right, the Two Eyes?
Yeah, they bumped into each other in the Two Eyes, and then went across the street to another cafe to seal the deal of the first Liverpool group to go to Hamburg, which was Derry and the Seniors.
Yeah.
But a most unlikely meeting, because Alan was, in Liverpool really all the time, 200 miles from London.
Right.
And Schmieder lived in Hamburg, but had come to London, and Alan happened to be there with Derry and the Seniors.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so difficult when you're reading The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away to separate fact from fiction, because these wildly improbable things actually happened.
Yeah. Well, quite a lot of wildly improbable things in that book didn't really happen, but that one actually did.
Yeah.
And I tested him on it. I really did try to get to the bottom of the truth of that one. And I believe it. I really do believe it. Something had to have happened, because he went to Hamburg the first time months earlier than July. He went in the end of January. And nothing happened till the summer. And it was because basically nothing was going to happen if they hadn't have bumped into each other again in London.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
There's so many stories like that.
Equally fantastic are some of the chapter titles in his book. Obviously courtesy of Bill Marshall.
Right.
But they're just great. I mean, this is in 1976. As a 17-year-old, I'm looking at chapter 2 is A Beaver in the White Slave Trade. And we got Gonna Kiss the Beatles' Bum. Leather Pants and Wielding a Whip.
Yeah.
You're my favourite, the little pox doctor of Hamburg. Guess who? What a self-description! Yeah.
And this is Alan, isn't it? He's so self-deprecating. Anything for a laugh, basically. And so the chapter titles they pack the laughs. The little pox doctor that's where he claimed to have been the man the Beatles turned to, or no, he didn't name who it was, did he? But certain Liverpool musicians who shall be nameless.
Yes.
Turning to him for advice because they fear they've picked up something in Germany.
What qualified him anyway?
He was older. I think that's probably all it was. He was something of a father figure to them. He was born in 1930, and obviously the Beatles were born in 40, 41, 42, 43.
Yeah.
41 being Pete, of course.
Yeah.
Older
than Brian as well.
Yeah, that's right. And that was a considerable, those few years was a gap there. Alan was an adult and they were youths still. So they would turn to him for advice. But he didn't say it was actually them, did he?
Right.
And it may not have been. Because the inference is that it must be them, but of course it might have been somebody else. But he claims that he would get them to pee into a pint glass and hold it up to the light and look for these kind of these little straggly worms or something that might or might not be there, and would obviously indicate VD.
Very scientific-like.
Exactly. Yeah.
Of course, one of the chapter titles, which is based on a true story, Ruby's my arse, so give 'em back, said George.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's another one of these little colorful vignettes that's in the book, and one that we know happens to be true.
Yeah.
Because I read separately from that how George came into possession of these uncut rubies.
Uncut rubies, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he must have had so many rubies, because I've read several accounts of him giving rubies away.
Almost as many as the ukuleles.
Remind me, Robert, how did he get those rubies? I read it, but I can't remember what it was.
It had to do with something with the Krishnas in India, and that somehow he'd got interest in a ruby mine or something like that, and that was how they compensated him. They gave him these things that looked like burnt peanuts, as he described in the book. And so, yeah, he was handing these things out, and it so happened that occasion over the Star Club tapes that him and Ringo, I guess, go pay a visit to Alan, and he is throwing that unpaid commission up in his face, and so he, as compensation, offers him these uncut rubies, and Alan doesn't believe what they are. And I guess Beryl ended up having them made into a necklace or something.
Yeah, I just love the fact that Alan knows them before they was what they was, right? And so he's actually ruby's my arse. He says to George Harrison,
and it wasn't the quoting line of the chapter something like, "It's been a long time since somebody talked to us like that."
Yes,
right.
Yeah. That bit I'm not so sure about. You mentioned Bill Marshall earlier. Bill was the ghostwriter of this book, and he could certainly dress up a tale, couldn't he?
It's a bit literary there, isn't it? But I'll take it anyway.
Yeah.
We got that 73 TV bit that used to be on YouTube where they're going around and they literally go to the office of that place where they find the tapes in a desk drawer.
Yeah.
A place that's getting ready to be torn down. Another one of these minor miracles in the Beatles story of how they were rescued that actually happened.
Yeah.
It's in Hackins Hay in Liverpool. Hackins Hay is one of my favourite streets in Liverpool. I always think it's the kind of thing you go to the doctor to complain about. Doctor, I'm suffering. I think I've got Hackins Hay.
Enter Alan Williams, a bankrupt nightclub owner, a pint-sized Welsh Liverpudlian with a thirst to make his fortune. He set out to find the missing tape, and his search brought him here to a back street in Liverpool.
Well, we eventually traced the tapes to this building, which is in Hackings Hay, which is coming down shortly. 5 years ago, there was a recording studio here, and the tapes were left there. The recording studio was closed, and when we eventually found the person who had the studio, we came back here, broke in, because this is the only possibility where the tapes could be.
And what happened? You went upstairs?
Went upstairs, broke in, and there were the tapes covered in 5 years' dust.
Where were they?
Just lying on the table there.
Now, Alan, what's so special about that tape?
Well, apart from its historical value, Ringo had just joined the group. I think it was Ringo's first professional job with the Beatles. And this was the Beatles' sound before they actually hit the big time. It's the greatest thing I've ever heard them do.
Why?
Because it is them in their raw, with no edges sort of cut or any studio tricks and things like that. That is the pure Beatles playing rock and roll.
Now, what's it worth?
Well, the mind boggles to what it is worth. I mean, nobody likes talking in telephone figures and things like that, but it's estimated if this goes out as a Beatles album, well, it could be anything, 8 million, 10 million, 20 million pounds.
As much as that?
As much as that. Well, an LP is £2. Now, the minimum sale that one would expect throughout the world must be about 8 million copies sold.
I must confess, having heard a bit of it, that the reproduction isn't all that hot, is it? I mean, you can't hear their voices as distinctly as you would on a record.
Don't you say that. It's marvellous.
Well, no, it's true. I mean, the reproduction isn't as good as it could be. So what could you do to get around that?
Well, the whole point is, the thing is, the condition it was done under, this is something that must be got over to the public. The
conditions.
The fact of the conditions that it was done on. It's a live show done between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning. But nobody was at their best, and I think the people would appreciate this.
What has been the major difficulty, then, that you've faced in getting this marketed?
The major difficulty is that people were, record companies were frightened, it appeared, to touch it because of the legal aspect, copyrights and whether we were legally, involved to be able to do this.
Well, you eventually managed to get to the Beatles.
We eventually got right to the top to the Beatles, and I had a fantastic meeting with Ringo and George. We hadn't met for 5 years, and we were there for 4 hours talking about old times. George finished giving me a present for Beryl, about 16 rubies, uncut rubies, and all sorts of little things like on the tape there, God bless you, Alan. And they liked the idea of it, and they said, sure. Somewhere along the line, they felt that it could be used, but they want 4 copies, 1 for each, and they will sort of dress it up and present it to Paul and John. At the moment, they're going through difficulties of their own, and as soon as this is sorted out, then we hope to have this out.
After Alan's funeral in Liverpool...
At which you delivered the eulogy.
At which I gave a eulogy, yes. I walked down Hackins Hay because I thought it was an appropriate place to walk down. That building is gone, but the street is still there. And that was also the street, on the corner of that street was the cafe where Brian Epstein went after his first meeting with the Beatles in the Cavern in November '61. he saw them and then went to Hackin's Hay. So Hackin's Hay has its place in the Beatles' history.
Where was it that Alan told Brian that he wouldn't touch the Beatles with an effing barge pole?
I think that was in the Blue Angel.
Okay.
In the Blue Angel nightclub, yeah.
So did you not take, also following the funeral, didn't you take a walk down Tithebarn Street, which is where Williams and Wooler had WW Associates?
20 Tithebarn Street.
Yeah.
I can never go there without thinking of Williams and Wooler.
Come on, let's get your take on the Williams-Wooler relationship.
Well, you have to have known Bob Wooler to really understand what was going on here. They were, shall I just do a little bit of bio on
Absolutely,
both?
absolutely.
We've done on Alan, but Alan we know. Alan ran the Jacaranda and the Blue Angel, and for a short while managed the Beatles. Bob Wooler was kind of, I liken him to being the Alan Freed of the Liverpool rock and roll scene, except he was nowhere near as extrovert. But he was the daddy-o, if you like. He all the groups would turn to him for advice. He was the DJ or the MC at most of the important shows, and certainly in the Cavern. So he presented the Beatles hundreds of times. No one else would have had that kind of association with the Beatles as Bob Wooler.
Wasn't he the one that John Lennon brought to the meeting with Brian and introduced him as his father?
Yep. Yeah, this is me dad,
right.
He said. And he was also the guy who John Lennon beat up at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party in June 1963. So Bob Wooler was an incredibly gifted guy for what he did, but how was he going to make his fortune from it? It's not easy for DJs to make a lot of money, unless you get on national radio, and he didn't really have the personality for that. He was good in the clubs, that's what he was, and he was kind of paternal figure to most of the kids who went to the clubs.
He would also suggest music for them, would he not? Because he was very astute musicologist when it came to what records were out, what people could actually perform well that would be really exciting for their sets. Yeah,
the one big example that we know about is that he suggested the Hippie Hippie Shake to Paul McCartney.
Chan Romero.
He did have the 45. In fact, he let Paul borrow it. Because though he was older still, he was born in 1926, though he never admitted to that.
Wow.
So really not of the rock generation, 4 years older than Alan Williams even.
George Martin's generation.
Yeah, same year as George Martin. He was really into it, and he loved encouraging people to do what they did best. But he didn't make a fortune from it, and ultimately at the end of the 1960s, it's all over. Well, in fact, it's all over a few years before that.
He had opportunities, didn't he, before that?
He did. But I think there was an application to be a DJ on BBC Radio 1, but he just wasn't really that kind of material. He wasn't extrovert enough.
Did he pen a memoir?
No.
Oh.
No, he didn't, but in the end, after his death, he died in 2002.
Spencer Lee.
Spencer Lee did a book called, I think, The Best of Fellas.
Yes.
Which is an excellent book, and I recommend that to anybody.
Yeah, it's the writing may not be great, but what's in there is absolutely priceless. I love that book.
Yeah, well, it's mostly first-person stuff from Bob.
Yeah,
and it's the closest you would ever get to a Bob Wooler book, because by his own personality, he was just a little bit too secretive to do his own memoir.
So it's kind of a many years from now.
But what happened was, at the end of the 60s and into the 70s, Alan and Bob kind of looked at each other and went, well, we're the survivors here. And they both survived the Beatles. Neither of them made much money from it. The scene was over. And what were they going to do? And they kind of started to look to one another to do ventures together. And as Richard and I could talk about this forever. From 1977, they put on Liverpool's first Beatles convention.
Yeah.
And then did 3 or 4 more before they became even bigger business, and they lost it. Yeah. And the business went to others who then put them on quite grandly. But the early Alan Williams and Bob Wooler conventions were really quite small-time affairs, befitting the fact that in those days, in the 70s, in Britain, it was quite hard to be a Beatles fan. There weren't many of us in those days. And those of us who were at those early conventions, we can when we see each other, we know it's like the veterans of a war kind of thing. We know who we were. We were there.
Right.
Oh, and it was fantastic for us, wasn't it? I mean, you said they were small-time affairs. Of course, when we jointly went to our first American one in February '81 at the Meadowlands in Secaucus, New Jersey, we were blown away by the scale and the attendance. But those early ones in Liverpool were just so magical for us. You know, seeing Liverpool, touring Liverpool with the Beatles' first manager as our tour guide, you know, and it was just great. It was a sense of community there, wasn't it, that we were with other Beatle fans.
Yeah, there was. It was wonderful. But it was all quite... I mean, I remember with the first Beatles conventions in Britain, my parents would say to me, are they going to be there? Is Paul actually going to turn up at this? And how do you tell someone who's evidently, well, obviously older than you, that they really don't know what they're talking about? Because we never expected them to turn up, did we?
No.
I mean, it was out of the question that they would turn up. But I remember the first time I met Alan was at Britain's first ever Beatles convention, which was in Norwich, of all places.
Yeah, I missed that one. I wasn't at that.
That was in August '76, and Williams was there, and there weren't too many people there. And Williams he'd already been doing the Beatle Fest in America, the Joe Pope ones and the Mark Lewisohn ones, I think, where there were huge crowds, and the auctions would, you know, the prices would go, well, we didn't know then how low they were, but they seemed really high prices.
Yeah.
And Norwich was deflating by comparison, and he was going, you know, he would be selling like a Stuart Sutcliffe painting.
Oh, and man, I remember those days.
Be going for like £50.
Yes, in America too, which is crazy.
Well, he'd be going, I could get $500 bloody for this in America. He was always swearing, Alan, and it didn't matter that it was in front of an audience. I could get $500 bloody for this in America. I'm not going to sell this for £50. But he did.
Yeah, I remember seeing him at one of the rock and roll auctions at Sotheby's, and 1964 Cavern membership cards, and him giggling away as one went under the hammer and saying, I got plenty more where those came from.
Yes, yeah, some of them are still wet, I think.
Of course, my copy of The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, which I got in March of '76, he signed it at the Ali Pali convention, that monumental flop at Alexandra Palace in December of '76. And he signed my copy to Richard, hope you enjoy my book. Many thanks, Alan Williams, '76. But your one, of course, had something a bit more apropos, didn't it?
Yeah, well, the same thing, but he added at the bottom, London Beatles Con. And genuinely pun unintended.
Yes.
That wasn't his event.
No.
He was there, but we remember him well because he was very entertaining, and he brought Lord Woodbine with him. Do you remember?
How can I forget? Because Lord Woodbine drew the lottery tickets out on stage, and that was the first time I'd ever seen someone literally staggering drunk. I mean, he looked like he couldn't even focus on the hat to pull the ticket out.
Had you read The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away already when you met him?
Yes, I had.
So you knew who Lord Woodbine, Harold Phillips was?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was like, wow, that's Lord Woodbine.
Wow, how cool.
Yeah, it was great to meet Lord Woodbine. It really was. I read it as a library book first, I think. And then I went to buy it in 1975, I think it must have been.
Right.
And I can't convey just what an enormous impact that book had on me.
Yeah.
Because we knew nothing about the Beatles' early years. Not really. I mean, there was some stuff in Hunter Davis, of course, but not like this. This was all complete revelation.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
the Aldershot story that's in
Right.
there, you know.
Norman
mind-blowing.
Chapman.
Yeah, Norman Chapman, yeah.
Yeah, Norman Chapman. Who ever heard of Norman Chapman before this book? And we really didn't know much about Tommy Moore.
Right.
No.
And just that whole thing about playing in strip clubs, and it was all just wonderful to read it.
So
course, to
much
keep your
of
tail
the
up.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the journalese by Bill Marshall has entered our own kind of lingo, hasn't it? You know, Lennon howling with glee when Tommy Moore lost his front teeth.
Yeah, and Dear Days Gone.
All gone. Yeah, we've used that many, many times down the years.
And me, that's one of my favourite ones. Me. You're feeling sorry for yourself.
Now, of course, you know, we get to Liverpool and those early conventions, and again, unforgettable memories for me. You know, I've got the photo of Alan there in Matthew Street near the site of the demolished cavern. And
Is that the one you posted when he died?
Yeah, I posted that when he died.
Okay, that's the one you're talking about.
Yeah. And then, you know, Bob Wooler, of course, standing near the side of the cavern as well and weeping while reminiscing about how the girls loved the Beatles there up on stage. But what great memories for us, you know, and going to Hayman's Green, Alan Williams hiding because Mona would be after him after how he described her in the book. And late night at the end of the convention, Alan Williams leading a conga in the centre of Liverpool.
Wow.
And we're all singing All You Need Is Love and me shouting the Beatles and punching my fist in the air at passing motorists.
Like you still do.
Yeah, nothing changed there then.
Right. But, I mean, what are your memories, Mark, your early memories?
Was this your first trip to Liverpool with the conventions as Beatle fans?
Yes.
So you had never been there before?
Correct.
And I can imagine how magical that must have been.
Totally.
It was both magical and depressing at the same time because Liverpool throughout the Beatles period is quite a depressed place, believe it or not, despite everything that's going on.
The first time I went there was a trash collector's strike, so you can imagine what the place looked like. And it was like it reinforced every negative thing I'd ever heard about the place being this downbeat, depressing kind of squalor, which also mischaracterizes it. But on that occasion, it certainly lived up to it.
Yeah, it was tough. In 1970s in Liverpool and then the 1980s on top of that were really bad times for Liverpool. It didn't turn around until, well, the 90s, I suppose. And it's in some respects it's turned around considerably now, but not in others.
Yeah, no one in Liverpool, when we were there in those days, in the mid-70s, the general people there in Liverpool really couldn't care less about the Beatles affiliation. You know?
It's funny because I remember as a stateside teenage fan at the time, there was a news report about them wanting to build a statue of them and being proposed. And some member of the city council or whatever, the quote was, the Beatles couldn't sing for toffee. You know, kind of resisting, you know, why would we want to honor these guys?
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, that was also Alan Williams's appeal fund to get the Beatles a statue. At these early conventions, there was always the hat would be passed around to put money in to raise funds for the building of this statue. And he and Bob were both trying to get it together. And they did raise, I think, at least £10,000. I can't remember. It was going to cost a little bit more and they were looking for funding, but it never came. And then the council, as you just said they couldn't have one anyway.
Mm-hmm. There was the quote that I remember reading was somebody approaching Williams saying, after what those guys did to you, why would you want to build a statue to them? And his reply being, wait till you see the statue.
Yeah. That is in that 1973 TV interview.
I think I would commission a statue to the Beatles in Liverpool somewhere as a memorial for what they've done to me.
What they've done to you, though, was basically to fire you as the manager, wasn't it?
Wait till you see the statue I'm going to build.
That is a brilliant distillation of Alan always having a good quip to finish off with. He was a funny guy.
Yes, he was.
He really was a funny man. Comedy was in his bones. And my enduring memory of Alan is a man who laughed a lot.
Yeah.
Despite it all.
Often his own misfortune. You know, one of the things I said in the eulogy at the funeral was how in 1967, this summer, 50 years ago, the summer of love, Alan Williams was in Spain trying to make his fortune from opening what we in England would call a stick rock factory. Yeah. Rock being the really hard, teeth-breaking candy that you would buy at the seaside, like Blackpool rock.
Yes.
It's something that is particular to Britain. And Alan was in Spain trying to make it there and sell it to the Spaniards. A mad idea. And it involves the melting of vast quantities of sugar. And it becomes obviously this very pungent, sweet smell. And I said to him in one of my interviews with him, what happened to that factory? And he laughed out loud and said, every wasp in Girona flew over to see what we were doing. And that was the end of that. that was it. You know, this mad idea to sell rock to the Spaniards, which is just insane. Spends money on building a factory, starts making the stuff, and all the wasps come, and that's it.
Another disaster.
Yeah, he laughed at it. He thought it was hilarious. And I love the fact that he would laugh at his own misfortune.
Yeah, I mean, his humility was actually one of his most charming attributes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. It was. And he had other attributes that were less charming.
Yeah, tell us about some of those, because I do remember him dubbing you something other than a Beatle expert.
Well, thank you, Richard. When I first started to research the Beatles, the first thing I did was their live appearances.
Yeah.
Alan's book was, a key guide to some of the things that they did before they were famous, and I was looking to actually apply dates to all of that. And I worked out that really Alan's association with the Beatles began in May 1960 and ended pretty much end of the year, late 60. He didn't do much for them in 61. He had those cards printed, but by then he was already not really looking out for them anymore. So he wasn't involved with them long, and that was my biggest problem with the book. Once I knew the facts, the book gives the impression he was really looking after the Beatles for about 18 months when it was more like 7.
Right.
And in much of that period, they were in Germany and not even under his nose anymore. You know, they were just over there and he was back in Liverpool. So me being the keen young researcher who liked to get everything right and didn't yet know much about subtlety or about how to behave well, took it upon myself in my first book to basically explain that Alan Williams was not as involved with the Beatles as he likes to make out.
Shall I read the quote?
Yeah, go on.
Okay. Liverpudlian Alan Williams, a stockily built opportunist who, from May 1960 until April 1961, became the group's occasional booking agent, or, as he still claims, their first manager, in quotes. Even now, more than 20 years on, the Beatles strongly dispute Williams's claim.
And that's not how he originally described him in his book, I'll let you know.
Mark?
Mark.
You're remembering something that I don't. Dare I say, remind me?
Didn't you, in the first draft of the book, refer to him as a small-town buck hustler?
I think it's in there.
Is it?
I think it might be.
And
and
the reference to his favourite, sitting at his favourite seat at the bar?
Yeah. I'm not proud of these things, but I was young a lot.
Oh, it's great, though. It's funny.
I was young, but...
You're channeling him.
These things were... when you actually look at those words, they're not that wrong. He was stockily built. He was an opportunist.
Yes.
He did sit at the bar a lot. He was there. The reason that I called him sometime booking agent is because they certainly booked plenty of gigs for themselves without his help.
Yes.
That's the best angle. Particularly, Pete really took care of the bookings from the end of 1960 until Brian Stein came along. For about a year, it was really Pete who was handling the bookings.
Right.
Do you think your reputation preceded you at the time you had this run-in with him?
Whose reputation? His or mine? No, I didn't really have a reputation at that point. Well, he knew me because I won the quiz at his Beatles conventions.
And that's another story as well.
Yeah, I mean, I got into all of this writing business. It really all began for me when that same Beatles convention at Alexandra Palace just over 40 years ago.
Wow.
There was this quiz called the Beatles Brain of Europe. Who knew more about them than anyone else in Europe, or which really meant the 55 people in the room. But some of them were from Europe.
It was your version of winning the World Series.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, that happened in 77 when I won the quiz the next year, and this was at Alan and Bob's first convention.
Right.
And when I recently looked at my prize for that, which is a pewter coffee pot, can't quite think what the connection with that and the Beatles is. It says World Beatle Brain.
Yeah.
So evidently, yes, I was the biggest Beatle brain in the world. But so he knew me. There's also a story spinning off from that, because it took me ages to get that prize out of Alan, and I had to embarrass him publicly to get it.
Wow.
She then held against me and took the mickey out of me when next time we met.
But going back to how you described in the book,
yeah.
So that then led to his reaction in a very public way.
The book came out in 1986, and there was a Beatles event in Manchester, which is 35 miles or so from Liverpool, and I went up there to sell a few copies of the book and sign some if anybody wanted it. And Alan was speaking there at the event, and I was sitting at a dealer table, and I couldn't quite make out everything he was saying. But every once in a while, he would say something just a little bit louder, and I could catch it. And he called me publicly a Beatle parasite.
Because everything was Beatle, right? It was the Beatle this, the Beatle that, and you were the Beatle parasite.
Yeah, exactly. I was the Beatle parasite. So no, Richard wasn't there for that, but I reported it all to him.
I love that whole thing. It's always resonated in my mind about you talking to other people, and you can just hear above the hubbub, blah, 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 Mark Lewisohn, blah, 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 Beatle parasite.
It was embarrassing, and I was regretting big time the fact that I'd written this already, and the book had only just come out, and I was already wishing I hadn't done it.
We just made do with laughter about him. I mean, this guy would introduce me during the auctions at these Liverpool events. Richard Buskin, who's been to every single Beatles convention. I actually hadn't been to the first one, but that didn't matter. And Alan would be doing this auction with a pair of glasses that were taped together with one branch missing. So that became one of our in-jokes as well.
Any time Richard and I see anyone with their spectacles with one arm missing, we just collapse.
Oh yeah. So anyway, how did the relationship then kind of recover from that?
I didn't see him for a while. That's probably how it recovered. I saw him I saw him a fair bit before that book came out, but soon after the book came out, I started working for Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
And soon after I started working for Paul, I was I was verbally encouraged not to attend Beatles conventions.
Wow.
It was made clear to me that, whilst you're working for us, we don't really want you going to those things, probably because they couldn't be certain what kind of things I might be divulging.
Right, yeah.
So I stopped going for many years, and I didn't return until about 2002, something like that, 2002.
Wow.
And by that time, it was all water under the bridge. And I saw Alan a lot after that, and he was always great. It was as if the other problem had never existed. He may genuinely have forgotten it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't going to bring it up. But from that point on, we always had very good times. So it was never a problem again.
So come on, what are some of your favourite Alan stories down the years? We already talked about the rock exploit in Spain. What are some of your other favourites?
Well, there's the one that's in the book, which is when the book was the first indication we ever had that the Beatles had cut a record in Hamburg in 1960 right, with Ringo in what he called, I think, the booth behind Hamburg railway station, but actually with research turns out to be a little recording studio across the street. So I dare say it might have sounded all right. It wasn't going to be just a little thing you'd record in a booth. And in the book he explains how he went to London and had one too many drinks and left the record in the back of a taxi.
Yeah.
Along with his overcoat, I think. Yeah. And we still don't have that record to this day. That was the only certainly known copy of it. I mean, there's been the guy who was singing on it, Wally from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, told me back in the early 80s that there were some copies in Australia.
Really?
But he's been approached since then and has never come up with one of them. So as far as we know, it really does not exist, that record. There isn't a known copy anywhere. And Ringo does bring up in interviews from time to time that it's the thing he most wants to hear.
Yeah.
Of all the Beatles collectibles out there, he's most desperate to hear that recording.
It's interesting because in the book, he describes the sound of his drums as like horse hoof clapping together on pavement.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's probably Bill Marshall. There is a picture in the American paperback. There is a picture of the label of that record.
Yeah.
So at some point, it was around and it was photographed. But in terms of actually having it as a record to play, it seems to be gone, and he just bloody lost it because he'd had a drink. And the funny story there is that in 1971, Alan organised, because he was always such an entrepreneur, Alan. He organised the first Mersey Beat revival. And I think this footage is on YouTube.
Yes, it is. It's fantastic.
Website. Because the same guy who was interviewed him in 73, a guy called Bernard Falk, who was a TV presenter often seen in the 60s and 70s, he actually had been in a group in Liverpool in the early 60s and was part of the scene and wrote for Mersey Beat. So that's how he began. And Alan put on this event called the First Mersey Beat Reunion or Revival, and it was a flop. It was 1971, and it was a flop. And he was going down to Apple to try to persuade Ringo to be part of it. And Ringo said, "I'll come and do it if you play me or give me that record." And that's why Alan had it with him.
Wow.
When he took it to London, that's why it was in London in his hands, because he was taking it to play Ringo. And he gets to Apple without it because he's already lost it. It's like it's gone down overnight, and on the first night he's lost it. So he goes to Apple the next day to see Ringo and says to Ringo, and Ringo says, "Well, where is it?" And he says, "I've lost it." And Ringo says, "You're a bloody liar, Alan. I want to hear that record." And he's lost it, and he really had lost it.
The demon drink.
It's amazing to me. You'd photograph the label but not make a tape dub of it.
Yeah. How about that? So that is a great shame. But it's a typical Alan Williams story that he lost the only copy because he had had a drink too many. And
I got to say that 71 sort of get-together may have been a flop, but those early Liverpool ones, especially the first one, was regarded, even if it was small scale, as a real success following the Ali Pali flop. And a lovely memory for me is I do remember at the very end of it on the Sunday, Williams and Wooler were up on stage together, and everyone gave them a round of applause for having staged this event, and they just sat there both beaming and shaking hands, and it was a sweet moment.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful. We didn't really talk too much earlier about the Wooler and Williams relationship.
Right.
Because it was Williams, they both liked to drink. But whereas Alan would get leery with a drink, he'd start, shouting and he was on occasions quite abusive to people, verbally abusive. Bob was a quiet individual, and he would just sit quietly with a drink, almost morosely, but Alan's behavior would embarrass Bob. But they were kind of glued together, if you like, because they were the two guys who might still make something happen. And might make something for themselves out of it at the same time. And they became this kind of, I wish I could think of a better metaphor for it, but they were just this double act who didn't quite fit. And this is epitomized in, it was something like, I'm guessing now, something like 1991. There was a live BBC radio broadcast from the Cavern. And they were brought up on stage, and it was going live to the nation. Bob Wooler and Alan Williams, and they had an argument on stage, and Alan swore, and this was live national radio.
Yeah, I remember you basically sending this to me or something, and me listening to it and us talking about this over the phone, and we were both absolutely cringing. That here they are in public, and they kind of made it their shtick in a way to be bickering with each other.
Yeah, they had. They had. Because Bob was always a punctilious guy. He liked everything to be absolutely accurate, and Alan didn't give a toss about accuracy. He just wanted to tell a good yarn, and they were really not meant for each other in any other respect other than that they were both left behind and both liked to drink and tried to do something together that might be good.
And they both got each other as well, didn't they? They both knew each other very well.
Yeah, it was kind of a relationship that they were a pair of misfits in a sense.
It was kind of fun, though, at times when we would hear something that Williams said about Wooler, which would be right on the money, and vice versa, with Bob, getting Alan, spot on.
Yeah, Bob would be pained always by Alan.
Yeah.
But there they would be in the pub together the next time you saw them, because that had become their life. And there's actually probably a good play or a book to be written about the two of them together, because it was far from harmonious, and yet they needed each other.
Yeah.
But back in the early days, how much interaction did they have with each other in the early 60s?
A fair bit. Alan was if you remember, this is something else I learned from the man who gave the Beatles away, that he was so inspired by what he'd seen in Hamburg when he went there, that he came back to Liverpool intent on opening a place called the Top 10 Club in Liverpool. And he got this place that was a bit of a barn, literally a barn, like wooden beams and everything. And it was a death trap, really, in terms of, as a fire hazard. And he opened this nightclub there called the Top 10 Club. It was going to be, he said in the book, the Beatles' home in Liverpool. This was before the Cavern put them on. They were going to be playing there. And it burned down after 6 nights.
Wow.
And Alan had asked Bob to be its permanent DJ and run the place for him as manager. And so Bob had thrown in his job. He was a clerk for British Railways. And Bob threw in his job, and after 6 nights, there was no job left. It was gone.
Wow.
It was gone. It was gone, all gone.
It was gone, all gone. And Bob was saying, and Bob started calling it the Soho Street hotspot. That was that, and it was because it's all weird the way these things connect up. It's because Bob was out of work, and that Alan said to him, "You can hang around at the Jacaranda and you can drink coffee all day for free, and it's on me. Don't worry about it." And that's when he bumped into George Harrison, who was back from Hamburg and looking for the Beatles to have some local bookings, and Bob got them the Litherland Town Hall date.
Right.
So we're talking December 1960.
Yeah, it all connects up. They did know one another, but really their paths were separate. But I mentioned the Blue Angel in that piece I read about Alan. The Blue Angel was the 60s nightclub in Liverpool, and it was Alan's club. And for a while, the Beatles were barred from there because, they had cut off his commission, and he was furious.
Right.
But eventually, I think Brian persuaded him to let the Beatles in. And Bob would often be there because it was, a late-night drinking club.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do talk about that in the book.
Yeah, I mean, did Alan have some sort of sway on the Liverpool scene at that time? Was he something of a bit, of a big shot in a small way, in terms of he owned these venues, he knew people?
Yeah, not so much the rock and roll scene. He got back into rock and roll once the Merseybeat boom was up and running in 63-4. He opened other clubs. He opened a club called the Maggie May, and he managed a group called the Nocturnes, who were the group in Lionel Bart's musical, The Maggie May. So Lionel Bart and Alan Owen. The funny thing is that he was a great friend of the writer Alan Owen before Alan Owen wrote A Hard Day's Night.
Wow.
These were the small circles in Liverpool. So when the Beatles hung out with Alan Owen during the making of A Hard Day's Night, they knew they were hanging out with Alan's great mate.
Yeah.
Was Lionel Bart from Liverpool?
No, he was a Londoner.
Oh, okay, that's what I thought.
Owen, he wrote the music for the book of Maggie May, which had been written by Owen.
Right. He also had written Oliver, too, right? That'd be his famous work.
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A brilliant piece of work. Liverpool's not a big city, not really. And, there's only a couple of degrees of separation in Liverpool. There might be 6 elsewhere, which isn't many, but in Liverpool there's only about 2. As soon as you start talking to people, you realize we went to the same school, or knew the same club owner, or whatever. Everyone's related, really.
Yeah, there's a photo, if you recall, in The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, of Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, and Bill Wyman signing the wall at the Blue Angel in the mid-60s.
Yeah, it was. In those days, pubs closed at 10:30.
Right.
And if you wanted to have a drink after 10:30, you had to go to a private club, and Liverpool was full of them. But the Blue was the club. And another one of my favourite stories, which I included in the eulogy, was the night in 1962 when he staged a bullfight in the club. A real bullfight with a real bull, and Alan as the matador.
What the hell?
What the hell?
Nowhere to hide.
Yeah, an insane thing to do, but it was all for a laugh.
Yeah.
And I mean, he could have been killed, but he wasn't. And just a ridiculous thing to do, and it made the front page of the Daily Mirror newspaper. in about May '62, I think it was.
A terrific promotion of his, which, as usual, is attached to a hard luck story, is the gig that was planned to headline Eddie Cochran.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that's the night that really started it all.
Yeah.
And it says everything about Alan. He went, like so many other people went, to see Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran play Liverpool Empire in, was it March '60, first week of March?
Something like that.
Stuart was there, George was there, John was there. I don't think Paul was there. But although in one interview he says he was, but in another couple of interviews he says he wasn't. But Alan went. For some reason, I'm not quite sure why he went, because it really wasn't his scene. And he just saw all the kids getting excited and thought, I'll have some of this.
Yeah. And
made a personal approach to Larry Parnes, the manager of well, he was involved in staging the tour. He put on the tour.
Mm-hmm.
And and he said to Larry Parnes, how much will it cost to bring this tour back to Liverpool for one night if I want to put them on? And they found a date. It was May the 3rd, 1960. Williams booked the boxing stadium, which funnily enough was owned by Pete Best's dad.
Yep.
Johnny Best. That's where he staged all his boxing bouts. And Billy Best, Pete's uncle, staged all the wrestling bouts. And Alan Williams booked it for a one-night rock show, and in that interim period, Cochran was killed.
Right. Wasn't Rory Storm and the Hurricanes supposed to be on that bill as well?
Yep, they were already down to be on it. And there's a great interview with Ringo in about 74, I think, where he was still cross with Cochran for getting killed before he could play with him.
Right.
Goes logic, I'm still mad with him,
Right.
How dare he die before I met him?
But the thing about Williams is, it's easy, and again, with his own help, denigrating his contributions and what he did and how things always went wrong. But you have to say that the man had the chutzpah, he had the self-motivation, and he had something of the vision.
The instincts.
To do these things.
Yeah.
It's not what other people were doing.
Yeah, I mean, thousands went to see the show that week. The Cochran Vincent show played 2 houses a night for 6 nights. There were 12 shows. Nobody else had the idea of putting it on as well.
Yeah.
No, he was alone in that respect. And he, made an effort to get Parnes' contact information and made the call and got the show put on. I've seen the contract. It was a big contract, £475 he had to find to pay the artists, and then more to book the venue. So he was, putting himself in for a large chunk of money on an uncertain return, and booked them and booked these other Liverpool groups to fill out the bill. Yeah. And then Cochran was killed, and was the show going to be on or wasn't it? And Larry Parnes said, yeah, Gene Vincent will play. And of course, poor Gene knew nothing about it. But he did play, and that was the start of it all. That was the night that turbocharged the entire Liverpool rock and roll scene.
Yeah.
That was the night that it really began.
This pattern you see from what you've been describing throughout this conversation is he's got the vision to see things before anybody else does, and he makes these efforts that don't take off as they might, but then other people end up making all the money.
He's the Sony Betamax of the Liverpool scene.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wasn't doing it to kickstart the Liverpool music scene. He was doing it to make some money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he went about it in a way that enabled opportunities for so many people.
Right.
It was the biggest gig in their lives for Cass and the Casanovas to this point. Cass and the Casanovas, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and Jerry and the Pacemakers, and others. The Beatles weren't in it. He didn't even know they existed. They weren't yet the Beatles anyway. They were in limbo, really. Mm-hmm. And that's the night that George Harrison, in that memorable interview he did with Alan Freeman in '74, when he was sitting by a crackling fire reflecting on life. And he said, and I stood there and I watched Rory Storm, who was in the suit, and he had all the moves, and they had all, they were moving in unison, and they looked like the slick rock and rollers. And George just stood there and thought, we're better than them. And they, at that point they weren't, but that was the Beatles' self-belief that they could be.
And that's the thing, I remember when John died and Alan was interviewed on BBC, I think. Yeah. And again, self-deprecating, he actually referred to himself at the end of the interview that I was a very small cog in a very large wheel. But what a vital cog he was.
Yeah, that was where he said, in a way that can easily happen in a live broadcast, didn't quite get the words out in the right order, and said of John Lennon that he suffered fools not gladly.
Yes.
Which we loved.
Yes, we did.
But of course, he was absolutely right. And the Beatles, it's worth also looking at it this way as well. The Beatles took the piss out of Alan all the time.
When we started off, we had a manager in Liverpool called Alan Williams, who was a small bloke, a little sort of high voice, little Welsh accent. Yeah, all right, lads. And he was a smashing little bloke, a great motivator, Alan, you know. We liked him a lot. But we used to take the mickey out of him, you know.
He was a little guy. He was 5'3". He had a high voice.
Not as high as Paul, of course, portrays it in Anthology.
Yes, he wasn't quite as high as Paul makes out, but that's an indication that that's the way they used to take the mickey out of him. And they took the mickey out of him all the time, which he didn't mind, but it could get personal because they sometimes where they drew the line of, you know, acceptability in jokes was not where anybody else would draw it. But they did take the mickey out of him. One thing they took the mickey out of him was that he never remembered who was who. He would call John George, he would call George Paul, and he would call Paul George. He always got them wrong, and they after a while that became something that didn't always amuse them. It's like, even now he can't get our bloody names right. And there's a picture in Mike McCartney's book, his first book of, I think it's in that book, or it's in a few books actually, of Paul McCartney in 1966 at a racecourse, at Aintree Racecourse in Liverpool, on the day of the Grand National, because the horse that he bought his dad, Drake's Drum, had won a race just before the National. And he was there in the winner's enclosure, and there are photographs in a few of the books. And Alan was there that day, and it's a nice occasion when Paul and Alan see each other in 66. The Beatles are massive beyond belief by this point. And there's Alan, and he called him John. Hi, John, nice to see you again. And Paul went, even now he can't get our bloody names right. The world knew he was Paul McCartney, but Alan still called him John.
Most likely pissed again.
He just had that kind of name blindness, you know, that some people have, word blindness or name. Just couldn't quite remember which one he was.
Of course, another thing that we just laughed about at the time was when he was promoting the book, and he even had cups with the mug who gave the Beatles away.
I know, I still drink tea out of them.
I mean, who portrays themselves that way? I mean, unbelievable.
Well, if you remember, we were at the Beatles convention, and it's like there was a stall with the mug who gave the Beatles away, and a picture of Alan Williams. It's like, oh my God, supposing he sees these.
Yes.
I mean, we got to hide them from him. You know, he'll be so upset, and then we realise he was selling them.
Another scheme.
I mean, if you talk about self-deprecating, that's the epitome of it.
The one where it went too far, and he allowed someone to dig at him too much, was that second book, the lesser known one. Was it The Fool on the Hill?
The Fool on the Hill.
Which that in and of itself, that using that title in that way was just so insulting. I was actually quite upset and angry at the time that this quote unquote co-author would, you know, denigrate the subject of the book in that way.
Still Alan's book.
I know.
The writer of that book, Lou Baxter, it was just the latest version of Bill Marshall.
Except that Bill Marshall didn't really put Alan down in that book. But in The Fool on the Hill, that's how he's portrayed, as a total fool.
There's a load of stories in that book, because it's a story of him going to all these Beatles conventions around the world and getting up to high old times. Because everywhere he went, Alan, he would always get up to something. And he would always leave his mark on the place after he left, you know. I mean, it would often involve drink. I mean, he did like a drink. You could say a little bit too much, in as much as some guys just get happy when they have a drink, and some guys get a little bit
nasty,
a little bit mouthy.
Yeah.
And Alan got mouthy.
Yeah. Yeah. But he, of course, I don't think it was anything to do with him, but it's just a great punchline to that story about that book that we've got quite a bit of mileage out of, that I actually sent money for the book, mail order, published by Bargepole Press, and never received the copy. So I got ripped off by Bargepole Press.
Really? Imagine that.
When I mentioned to Alan that Richard sent off money for the book and never got it, and he was really disappointed. He was an honest guy, Alan. He was very disappointed that someone had sent off money and not got the book.
Still never sent me a copy.
I'll have a word with him about that. Well, he may have had a word with them, but you still never got the book.
Yeah.
Well, at least you were called a parasite.
Yeah. Beatle Parasite.
Beatle Parasite, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
It's an official title.
You didn't rank that high.
So what about in later years when you saw him?
Yeah, he when I was writing Tune In, I wanted to go through everything with him from the start. And actually, I'd never interviewed him. All those years of knowing him, I'd never just sat down and interviewed him because there didn't seem to be any need. But now there was a need, and I told him I really wanted to do it properly, and that might mean him contradicting some of the stories that are, in his book.
Yeah.
He was fine with that, and we kind of went through his book and worked out which bit was Bill Marshall enlarging the truth, and which bits really were true. And I got, I think, in the end, 4 long sessions with him, which I was really pleased to have. And he was very generous with his time. He understood, that we've got to get this right now, and gave me all the time that I needed, which was great.
Yeah, and not one of these guys who'd say he wants money for it.
No, he wasn't. But it'd be nice if can you buy me lunch kind of thing. That was one of them. So we actually went out to when he died. I posted a picture of me and him outside the Blue Angel. That was taken in about 2004, because both the Blue Angel and the Jacaranda are there again now.
Yeah.
When we went to Liverpool in '77, they were gone, weren't they?
Oh yeah.
The buildings were there, but they were called other things. And now, of course, with the Beatles industry in Liverpool, they're back to being the Blue Angel and the Jacaranda.
Right.
It would be amazing to get a new version of The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away with this annotation that he provided to you.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of all, it would be. You're absolutely right, it would be. It's kind of all in Tune In. Particularly the engorged edition.
Yes.
What I realized when I wrote Tune In, more than I'd ever realized as clearly as ever than before, is that he did make everything happen for them. Yeah. In May 1960, they were clueless. They didn't have a drummer. They didn't have any bookings. They didn't have any means of getting themselves onto the next rung of the ladder. And although Alan Williams wasn't trying to make stars out of them, he did provide every opportunity from which they developed. The gigs in Wallasey, which were their first real Liverpool gigs or Merseyside gigs, the Grosvenor Ballroom, which is a great venue to visit, still there in Liverpool, still exactly as it used to be.
Wow.
And then he got them to Scotland on the Johnny Gentle tour. That was entirely his making. And he got them to Hamburg, and without any of those things, but particularly Hamburg, the rest of it wouldn't have happened.
Everybody hung around in this club called the Jacaranda, which was owned by Alan Williams, and that was the place in Liverpool. And he, had these steel bands on and the rock bands. He ran all the bands in Liverpool, and so we started hanging around there before we were really formed a band. When there was just me, Paul, and George. And we were always looking for drummers, and he used to let us practice downstairs, and then he let us play a few dances, and he first took us to Hamburg.
This band called Derry and the Seniors, they got offered this job to go to London, give up your jobs and come to London, and you go in with Larry, right? And so they all gave up their jobs, and then they didn't get a gig. So they were a bit pissed off at that. So I remember them saying, "We're going to London. We'll get that Ponzi and beat him up." So Alan Williams, who was the club owner, who did the audition, and it was sort of, he was probably the first big groupie of Liverpool. He drove him to London and said, "Well, bring your instruments, lads." And you never know, he could get a gig. So he got him a gig in the Two Eyes in London. So they were playing there, and this fellow, Bruno Koschmieder, from this club in Hamburg, right? I think it was him, and he saw them and booked them to go to Germany. And then later he sent a message saying, I want another band, because we were probably so cheap. Send us another band. So Alan Williams came to us and said, OK, lads, you can have this job in Germany. The only problem is you've got to be 5 people. He's asked for a 5-piece band. At that point, Paul was the drummer because all the drummers didn't show up. And so
the only way we could get to Hamburg, we had to have a drummer. And we just heard that this guy was, we knew of this guy who was living at his mother's house who had a club in it, and he had a drum kit.
So we thought, OK, well, we'll get a drummer. Where do we get a drummer from? I said, well, I remember there's this guy I met who just got a drum kit for Christmas. His name's Pete Best.
Pete, good mate. His mum had a club where we played, you know.
He was known on Merseyside as mean, moody and magnificent. Pete Best.
And then we had all sorts of different drummers all the time, because people who owned drum kits were far and few between. It was an expensive item, and they were usually idiots, you know. We got Pete Best just because we needed a drummer the next day to go to Hamburg.
He came down to the Jacaranda Club. We did a quick audition with him.
And we just grabbed him, auditioned him, and he could keep one beat going for long enough.
And jumped in the van and went to Hamburg.
That was all Alan Williams is doing, to put on an audition for the great star maker. He's coming back to Liverpool and you can all audition for him. I mean, what a moment.
Amazing that he actually connected with him to do that, you know, he comes to Alan Williams to put this on.
Well, after the gig at the stadium, Larry Parnes has seen Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. He's seen Jerry and the Pacemakers and Cass and the Casanovas. Yeah. And Williams said, there's a lot of talent up here. And Fury's already from Liverpool. Right. But Parnes says, you know, well, maybe I could use these groups. We're looking for a backing group for Billy. Yeah. And if you arrange an audition, we'll pick one. And it all happens very quickly because 1 week later they're back. And that's when, in that week, that's the week the Beatles get together.
And now I remember Alan actually, you know, telling the story about I think it's when he saw the Beatles on Sunday night at London Palladium, and he realizes that, you know, they're here to stay, that they've made it big now. And that's when he, you know, throws the pillow or the cushion at the TV set and said in this interview, had it been a brick, I'd have thrown that as well. Yeah. But he never actually tried to muscle in, and neither did Bob, for that matter, did he? You know, once they did become famous, he wasn't after them for, you know, his commission or for anything.
What could he do? I mean, there's nothing he could do.
But we know of others who did try, right? But he didn't, did he?
No, he certainly didn't. No, who else did? Did anybody? I'm not sure. Anybody.
Well, I'm thinking of Millie Sutcliffe.
Oh, well, that was a wholly different thing because she felt that John and Paul and George had not given Stuart sufficient due. That they kind of turned their back on him, right, and weren't being as supportive as they could have been. That was her opinion, right. But she had nothing on them in terms of forcing them to dig up money or anything, right. But there's another thing. Alan and Stuart that's the original friendship, is Alan and Stuart. Right. That's really why he was helping them, because they were Stuart's friends.
Yes.
And he brought Stuart in to paint.
Yeah. He had Stuart paint the murals in the basement of the Jacaranda.
They all used to hang out the Jacaranda. I used to let them rehearse in the basement for free. And I thought, well, these are great. These groups are good. Rory Storm, Jerry Marsden, a group called the Big Three. And we had these art students used to hang around the Jacaranda. They used to, you know, miss lectures. And amongst them who became friends was Stuart Sutcliffe and John Lennon. And knowing that Stuart and John were from the art school, I asked them would they redecorate the ladies' toilets, which they agreed for a fee of £10. So the first money I ever paid the Beatles was £10 to paint the ladies' toilet. And they made such an awful mess of it. I preferred the graffiti.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned this because, yes, that was the friendship that kind of opened the door for the Beatles to become involved with Williams. But in a sense, and I don't know how much this would have been the co-writer of the book, but the whole story of the Parnes audition, and he will only accept the Beatles if they get rid of Stewart because he was so terrible and inept. I mean, isn't he in a sense throwing Stewart under the bus there, because we know that was not the case? There's the pictures of him with his back apparently turned. And starting the whole story that he was so bad at his instrument that he would hide his fretting fingers from the audience, as if their ears wouldn't be telling them that he couldn't play. That is where that myth starts, is it not?
It certainly really took ground from that one, yeah. But he swears that is true. I said to him, but aren't there other reasons why they were rejected? And he said, no, it was definitely that.
Well, Parnes denied that.
Yeah, I know, but Parnes and the truth were not always 100% friends, were they?
Yeah. So, what do you think?
I don't know, because I wasn't there. I mean, I said to Alan, really, and he went, yeah, really. Mm-hmm. So that was his truth. People take, sometimes in life it's like Rashomon.
Right.
People witness the same event differently.
Yeah.
And we don't actually know. Funnily enough, I don't think that John or George or Paul ever really spoke about it, about why they didn't get the Billy Fury audition role. None of them. Nobody got it, actually.
Yeah. There was a London group that was the Tornadoes that he ended up hiring?
He ended up with them as his recording group.
Yeah.
The guys who would be the Tornadoes, yeah. But Stewart must have been a poor... Well, we've got those tapes. We know how poor Stewart was at that time.
But then he ended up being drafted into that band of various musicians put together. He must have been competent enough to be able to hold his own in that sort of situation.
I take Klaus's word for it that by 1961 Stewart was perfectly competent bass player.
Yeah, primitive but a solid rock bass player.
Yeah, but he could play. Yeah. But I've no doubt that in May 1960 he had almost no stage experience. In fact, pretty much none.
Right. He wasn't even particularly a rock and roll fan, was he?
He liked Elvis. He had quite a good record collection, actually. So he did like it. He liked the pose though as much as he liked the music.
That's true.
Stewart was about pose, which was very important. There's no doubt about it. He gave the Beatles a look.
Yes, the visual presentation.
An attitude. So, but it's important to know that the Alan Williams Beatles connection really happens through Stewart.
Yeah. Well, of course, the dedication of his book is for Stewart and Rory, who never quite made it, but then who did.
Yeah, which is a great dedication. It all happened really by complete chance, because this coffee bar, the Jacaranda, which was the one beatnik place in town. So anyone who's kind of, slightly off centre would always go to that place, as opposed to the Cardoma, say, where all the shopping women were. They opened this place in Slater Street in Liverpool, directly opposite, by complete chance, an artist supply shop called Jackson's, which is still there. If anyone is listening to this, next time they go to Liverpool, go to Jackson's art shop on Slater Street, because that's where John and Stewart used to go to get their painting materials.
Wow.
It's there. No one ever goes there because no one thinks of the connection, but it's important. And because the artists from the art school would go there to get their equipment, they would then go in the Jacaranda for a coffee, because it was right opposite.
Wow.
So it's merely the location of the Jacaranda that brings Stewart and John in through the door.
So the Caribbean Steel Drum Bands, that was one of the first acts that he had booked, was it not, through Woodbine?
Yeah, they were. Woodbine had this group. They played the steel band. I mean, as you said, his real name was Harold Phillips. Mm-hmm. But all Calypsonians were called Lord something.
Yeah.
And Woodbine was a brand of smokes, right?
Yeah. Very cheap and strong cigarettes. Yeah.
Yeah. No filter.
Yeah.
Strong tobacco, no filter.
Yeah.
And cheap, very cheap. So although you can never quite believe what you read, because I read something just the other day in which Woodbine said that he never smoked them. That he smoked some other brand. So what the hell?
Right.
But he had the Royal Caribbean Steel Band, and the story goes, and I have to put it that way because the absolute truth may never be known. What we understand to be the truth is that the Caribbean Steel Band, one day they were gone. He turned up at the Jacaranda. They weren't there. Where are they? They've gone to Hamburg. Why Hamburg? Or a postcard arrives saying, having a great time here, wish you were here.
Mm-hmm.
So Alan then decides to go to Hamburg with Woodbine to find them. That's when he goes into the Kaiserkeller and meets Bruno Koschmider.
And this was the January 1960 trip?
Yeah. Which was basically a businessman's dirty weekend to Amsterdam to go to strip clubs and things on the red light district. And him and Woodbine carried on and went to Hamburg from Amsterdam, which is not that far. However, I'll share something with you which happened to me when I was writing Tune In, which was that I was always determined to track down one of the members of the Royal Caribbean Steel Band. Lord Woodbine had died by this point.
In a fire.
Is that right? I didn't remember that.
Yeah, that was, I believe they both died, him and his wife.
Oh, God, how awful.
Lord and Lady Woodbine.
Yeah. We did call her Lady Woodbine. Do you remember one?
Yes, we did. That's why I just said it.
So I was always intent on tracking down one of them, and they're named in Alan's book as like Everett, Otto, Bones, and Slim. You can't exactly look them up in the phone directory, can you? But I was reading, I think it was the Liverpool Evening Express from about 1958, just turning every page, just seeing what I might find. And there was an article about the Royal Caribbean Steel Band, and it had their real names.
Wow.
So then I thought, well, these are the guys I need to look for. And I found Everett, who lives still, or lived, I'm talking now about 10 years ago. I tracked him down to a house in Toxteth, which was where it was always the West Indian part of Liverpool. Very much a ghetto in those days, back in the late 50s. And I phoned him up. I got a number. I phoned him up, and I invited myself round to see him on my next trip to Liverpool. And I went there, and the first thing he did was offer me an interesting refreshment when I got in through the door, which I felt, in the circumstances, since I was there to do work, I ought to decline. And so he said, well, what can I do for you? So I'm sitting there. The room was pretty dark. He was sitting across the room from me. And I got out my recording equipment and I got out my questions. And I said, okay, well, I'm here to talk about the Royal Caribbean Steel Band. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. That was a long time ago. And I went, yeah, it was. Yeah. And I'm here to talk about your trip to Hamburg and how all that happened. And he looked at me in the eye and he said, we didn't go to Hamburg.
What? What a start.
And I just thought, what? Really? You didn't go? No, we never went. I said, but it's in all the books that you went to Hamburg. That's why Alan Williams went to Hamburg, to look for you. We never went. So I went, okay.
Never mind.
And, a few more questions, but that was pretty much it. I mean, there was nothing left to ask. I wanted about Hamburg, and there was no story.
Could he prove he never went?
I love that story because I'm old enough now to realize that although you can go looking for the truth, sometimes it's very, very hard to be certain about anything. There are things that just will not add up. And so although I believe that story, maybe he didn't go, but others did, and he doesn't remember them going. What other reason would Alan Williams have for going to Hamburg and meeting Bruno Koschmider? What other reason would there be?
Right.
And Woodbine never denied it.
Yeah.
But I just love the fact that when I finally tracked one of them down, he completely said, no, it never happened.
Wow.
That's the peril of being a historian. I mean, you can go looking for certainty, but sometimes you just can't find it.
Is Beryl still around?
Yeah, Beryl is still around, and she's 86 now.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw her at the funeral, of course, and she's great. Beryl has never really done an interview.
Beryl was my tour guide on the Magical History tour of Liverpool.
Yeah, she was an extraordinary woman. Beryl still is, actually, a remarkable little woman. I mean, small in height, but strong-minded, powerful woman.
Yeah.
And she was a big part of those early events, wasn't she? I mean,
yeah.
She was on the buses with us going around Liverpool. In those days, most of the buildings in Liverpool were still there.
Yes.
They hadn't yet been flattened.
Litherland Town Hall. I've got photos of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
except for the cavern, which,
Yeah.
We stood on that patch of ground in 1977.
Yeah.
It had only been gone 4 years, and it was tragic.
Yeah. It was.
Absolutely bloody tragic that we couldn't go down the cavern.
And a pathetic little tribute up on a wall, basically, just marking the spot. That was it.
Well, it's the Arthur Dooley sculpture,
Yeah.
which, and Alan Williams was Arthur Dooley's great champion in Liverpool. Arthur Dooley was an important sculptor in Liverpool, and Alan exhibited him at the Blue Angel.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I should sort of say, when I said pathetic, I don't mean that the actual sculpture was pathetic, but that was all that Liverpool could muster for.
Yeah, the representation.
Yeah.
That was all it was. That was all there was to look at, was the Arthur Dooley sculpture that had only gone up in about 72 or 73. Yeah, I know.
Was that the Four Lads Who Shook the World?
That's it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And kind of Madonna figure.
Yeah.
With a little cherub, I think, was added to it after John died.
Okay. So that predates the thing that he was trying to get going later in the 70s when the councilman said they couldn't sing for toffee.
Yeah. That was a real sculpture. Incidentally, when Wings played in Liverpool in 79, that statue fundraising scheme was still going. And Paul inevitably was asked about it by the Liverpool press. What do you think of the plans to have a statue? And he said, I don't want a statue. It's only bloody scrap metal, and much better if they give the money to something more interesting, like trying to set up a school for musicians.
Which eventually happened.
That's the start of his mind is working there towards Lipper, but he doesn't know it yet.
Wow.
But he didn't want a statue of the Beatles, which is interesting.
Yeah.
79 was too recent still.
Yeah.
But Stella got hers.
In what sense?
Statue, did you see it?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did.
Yeah, she got hers, yeah. So as we sort of wind up this show, I want to quote from Alan Williams' book, The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, the concluding chapter, Cold Around My Soul. And I'll just read a few paragraphs from it. It opens with, "The Blue Angel is no longer in my possession. Likewise the Jack. My business ventures haven't gone too well, and I've struck a bad patch." A bit of mileage there for us. And then a few paragraphs later. "A few days ago, I went back to Hamburg to walk around the Reeperbahn on a kind of sentimental journey. I took with me an antique wood carving of a golden angel. I'm stripping the interiors of derelict churches in Liverpool to make an honest buck, and I thought I could sell this golden angel for a few marks. I lost my coat." Of course, we never hear why he lost his coat, but we can guess, can't
It's inferred.
How many times have you lost your coat, honestly?
Never.
Yeah.
It was a freezing day, and I found myself wandering around Hamburg, shivering with the cold and hugging this golden angel to my breast. As I was walking down the Reeperbahn, a guy I knew from the old days in Hamburg ran up to me and said, "Hey, it's Alan Williams, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said, what was left of him. "What happened to you and the Beatles?" The wind seemed to blow colder round my soul. I could have cried, hugging my golden angel to my frozen body. But I'm not really the crying kind. Maybe tomorrow, but not today.
It's wonderful.
It is, isn't it? Bill
It is.
Marshall or not, it really nails it.
Very much Bill Marshall, really. But yeah, it does nail it.
Yeah.
An optimist, always the sun will shine tomorrow.
Yes, but it's always about his latest disaster. But that thing about I lost my coat, you and I had many hours of laughing about that one.
If we can find the coat, we might find the acetate with Wally.
Yeah,
there you go.
Exactly.
You never know. When we first met him, he was do you remember he was acting?
Yes, he was, because he actually, during that first Liverpool convention, up on stage, he actually gave a short performance.
He did. Now, if you look up on Wikipedia, the Illuminatus trilogy, I'm reading it now, a series of 3 novels written by Robert Shea, that's of Shea Stadium fame, obviously. Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson, published in 1975. It's a satirical, postmodern science fiction adventure story. It was being put on at that time in Liverpool by a brilliant anarchic comedian called Ken Campbell. And both Alan and Beryl were in it.
Wow.
Alan was the singing dolphin in it. And he had to be on it on stage stark naked at one point. And believe it or not, and this is a story that's in his book, The Fool on the Hill, Jane Asher was in the audience one night in about 1976 in Liverpool and saw Alan Williams stark naked, and according to Alan, laughed at the size of his manhood. Again, only Alan would tell us that.
Right.
Yeah. But the Illuminatus trilogy actually is quite an important thing. So Alan was one of these guys who just got involved in interesting things.
Yes.
You know, he was a club owner, and he took the Beatles to Hamburg, and he did the Illuminatus trilogy, and he put on the scaffold at one of their first gigs in the Blue Angel, and he was just an enabler, and I think that's just fantastic. And at the funeral, one of the cast members from that show got up and said how incredible Alan and Beryl were because they put up the entire cast in their home. And that reminded me of something that I meant to mention in my eulogy, but there really wasn't time for it, which is that when Stuart first brought Astrid to Liverpool, Millie, Stuart's mother, did not want Astrid in the house because she was German. This was still obviously very close to the Second World War.
Yeah.
So they stayed with Alan and Beryl.
Wow.
After that, whenever Astrid came to Liverpool, she stayed with Alan and Beryl. And when Klaus came to Liverpool for Stuart's funeral in '62, which the Beatles missed because they were in Hamburg, he stayed with Alan and Beryl as well. So Alan and Beryl always kept kind of open house for interesting people to pass through. And in that way, he connected with a lot of people. He was an extraordinary individual. And I'm really without him, the Beatles wouldn't have gone to Hamburg, and therefore none of it really would have happened. But also in our lives, you know, he's lit up our lives in a very special way.
Yeah.
He's given us so many laughs. He's given us so many good times that he needn't have done.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I just think that's wonderful. That's why I wanted to do the eulogy at the funeral, because he touched so many lives. And, you know, that's a great gift to have at the end of the day.
And I have to say, even though we don't expect anything from the Beatles, and we often don't get much, the fact that Paul and Ringo did issue a statement after Alan Rouse died, it's just disappointing to me that there was no word from them following Alan Williams' death.
It's very small.
Yeah.
And considering in contrast to, you know, what you guys have been describing as Alan's largesse and his curiosity and his generosity of spirit.
Yes.
Yeah, it's quite a contrast there, isn't it?
Yeah.
He was a great propellant for them, you know, and big enough for them to mention. In fact, right back at the beginning, we were talking about why was he their manager. With the Beatles Live, I included the flexi-disc record of their first radio interview, the Monty Lister interview.
Yes.
October '62, which is, you know, circulating widely now.
Yeah.
And Paul says, they say, how did you first go to Hamburg? And Paul says it was all through this guy who used to manage us, the Alan Williams of the Jacaranda Club. So Paul said that he was their manager. And really, it would have been nice if they had. They're not great at acknowledging people who have helped them along the way, but I'd like to have seen them say something a little bit more about Alan, because he was a one-off.
Yeah.
And he did so much for them in a short space of time. And ultimately, the relationship broke because they broke it. It wasn't Alan breaking it. They broke it by refusing to pay his commission.